Okay, well, you have to start with the identifying what the right problem is. Okay, so everybody's been concentrating on the difference in numbers, and you've had people that are fighting for one set of numbers versus the government's numbers. So the government's numbers say it's X, and the bank numbers say it's X divided by 2, for example. And people have been, depending on where you are, you support one side or the other. The actual facts are as follows. The IMF doesn't think X or X over 2 is the right number. They think the right number is 1.5X. So the IMF believes that the right numbers are about 50% plus or minus, I don't know the exact number, about 50% higher than even the government's numbers. That said, that's not where the problem is. The problem is really more about the allocation of losses. Okay, so the reason that the banks are arguing for the lower number isn't because they believe that the numbers are lower or something like that, because it actually doesn't matter. You're going to ask, you're basically begging for money. So you want the losses to be as large as possible to get the largest amount possible, right? That makes sense. In the same way that you might inflate your income if you're trying to apply for a loan from the bank. So the problem with the allocation of losses is that the IMF doesn't do bailouts of, rich people and banks. The IMF, they believe in something called the moral hazard. So what the IMF will do is they will want to allocate the losses, and the losses very clearly should go to a large part with the banks, large depositors, etc., just like what happened in, say, Cyprus. And then they write checks to the country. The powers that be in Lebanon have been so used to the idea of, like Pari 1, Pari 2, Pari 3, of just receiving checks for nothing, or I'll promise to do it later on, that they thought this is the same thing, and they've been playing the same game. The IMF just ain't buying that stuff. So that's what is breaking down the whole thing. Okay, well, look, it's pretty clear that there are massive losses. You're talking, losses, 75, 80 billion, 100 billion dollars. Those losses of that magnitude are big for, for a country like the United States, let alone a piddly little nation in the Middle East like Lebanon. So the idea of a forensic audit is, makes sense. You want to know where the money went. And there have been many people objecting to the whole forensic audit thing. Some on the grounds that it's linked to, the Zionist entity, quote unquote, or what have you. But one of the things I said in an interview, you can find, if you've got objections about Kroll specifically, you can find another forensic accountant. If you find a regular accountant, then you haven't done anything. We already have regular accountants. We have PricewaterhouseCoopers, we have Ernst & Young, working in Lebanon already. I think KPMG, maybe another one. So the big four are already in Lebanon. The difference is that the forensic accountant, regular accountants are what's called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Generally speaking, if you give them certain numbers and they're not egregiously wrong, they'll sign off that the math works. But they don't go in and say, okay, well, how did you get this number or that number? They don't go into that level of detail. Sometimes they do, or sometimes if it's egregious, they'll object. Like, for example, a major bank in the last couple of days issued their financial statements, and the auditor, both the local and the foreign auditor, refused to sign off on the financial statement. But that's not really enough. What you want to do is you want to find out exactly where the money went. And some people objected, well, why are you doing BDL? Why don't you do the Ministry of Finance too? Like, okay, let's do the Ministry of Finance. We don't have a problem with that. There should be forensic audits wherever we can get them, So in my mind, if they don't pick a forensic accountant, meaning Sherlock Holmes or Lieutenant Colombo, then they're not serious about trying to find the money the way what's referred to in Arabic, isti'adat al-amwal al-manhuba, the recovery of stolen public funds. And that's really why the forensic accounting is important. But also, there's another reason it's important, that the IMF, the guy who signs off on the check, or the girl in this case, she wants the forensic accounting. She wants to know where the money went. It kind of makes sense. We kind of have bigger problems than it depends what restructuring means. In a situation like ours, where the banking sector has, let's just say, it's not doing too well. I don't want to use the word collapsed. Generally, what needs to happen there is, if you are in a well-functioning regulatory environment, what happens is that every bank is looked at, and you look at this, Bank A, and you say, okay, this bank, for example, is no longer able to continue as a going concern. So you try to find, you either unwind it, or you try to have somebody acquire it, like JP Morgan acquired Bear Stearns. The other option, it just goes down, like Lehman Brothers just went down. And then, then you go to other banks, and Bank B might be, okay, it's got problems. It can't continue as a growing concern, but we can save it by injecting capital. So then you give the shareholders the option of injecting new capital, quote unquote, fresh cash or fresh dollars, as the term is popular now in Lebanon. And then that becomes a going concern. If they don't do that, then you do the same thing as Bank A. And then Bank C could be a bank that is okay, it can keep functioning. And so you try to divide the banks into buckets of A, B, or C. And then you try to merge some of them, you try to unwind some of them, etc. That's basically what the idea of a restructuring is. This is an outstanding question. So look, people like me don't like pegs in general, because to me, a peg is camouflages, what's wrong. It's like you being sick. If you take a medicine that suppresses your temperature, it doesn't mean you're not sick anymore. It just means you don't know you're sick. So by having a peg, that way we don't know how bad our balance of payment deficit is or fiscal deficit is. You mask the problems, and they go on for a long time. That said, that doesn't mean that a peg is a bad thing. As a policy, you can have a peg even though it's economically a bad thing. So I look at it like Social Security in France. Rich people get taxed very high, and this money flows to, for example, to the unemployed or to the poor. That's fine. If the majority of French people want that, you do it. So in Lebanon, if the majority of Lebanese want a peg, want to give a high standard of living to every person in Lebanon, that's fine if the majority of Lebanese are happy with it. The problem there is that the price became too high, in the sense that at one point we were just being subsidized by cash flow from expats. And then at some point it turned into actually using up the savings of mainly expats. And that's when it became a very, very bad thing. So the answer to your question is that in retrospect, I mean, if in 2008, whether it would have been obvious to see that floating the currency is the right thing, and it was the right thing floating in 2008, by the way, you're right. The problem there is if you're in the middle of it, it's not so obvious except retroactive vision. So if you floated in 2008, it actually would have increased. It would have gone to 1,000 per dollar. And then by 2011, it would have gone to, say, 1,100, 1,200, 1,500, etc. Until today, it would have been at 2,000, and then we would have been finished with the problem. As it goes, there's another possibility. The other possibility was 2016. Instead of in lieu of the financial engineering, we probably should have floated the currency and done what we're doing now in terms of capital controls. The damage would have been much, much less. I mean, yeah, it's like a new thing. Remember, the country's had it back for 22, 23 years. So the whole floating thing is something culturally, unless you're old enough to remember the last time, it's not something we're used to. So there's a component of the change which is structural. So the fact that the central bank is no longer supporting the peg at 1507.5, and the fact that there isn't enough flow of dollars coming in means that the lira must devalue, and that's that trend is unavoidable. However, it can overshoot one way or the other. So as an example, in just what happened recently, it went up to 10, 11,000, then went right back to 7,000. I mean, part of that move was fundamental, based on fundamentals, but the other part was based on rumors and speculation. So what's the fundamentals? So for example, as you know, when the central bank came out with a circular taking the dollars from OMT, Western Union, and giving you 38.50, so what that meant was that anybody sending dollars was losing the dollars on the way, and getting whoever's getting it here is losing the dollars, getting lira instead. So when the announcement to open the airport happened around mid-June, so if you're sending money from Dubai or Saudi, guess what? You told your dad, hey, why don't you wait a couple of weeks? I'll send it with my cousin Alex instead of by OMT. So the dollars coming in from that source, this is one of the two sources, fresh accounts is the other one, dried up. And as a result, the supply of dollars fell precipitously, and then the lira devalued to up to 10,000. Then the airport opened July 1st. You'll notice right the next day, it started dropping. This is all the people coming in after they kissed their parents. Hi, how are you? I miss you. They went to the Sarraf to change. So the drop went down to, say, 8,000. That's fundamentals. Now, beyond that, it was rumors, innuendo, manipulation of the market, stuff like that. Okay, but the move up to 10, from 8 to 10, 10 to 8, that's fundamentals. So along the way, so basically what the market is trying to do now is find what's called the equilibrium level. Once the market determines what the average amount is coming in on these planes every day, it's estimated to be 2 to 5 million. One minister said 30 million. I find that number too high, but let's go with 5 million. So when it finds that right level, then it should get to that equilibrium point, and then it goes back to devaluing, but at a steadier pace instead of this quick up and down and volatile movement. I mean, look, I described in an article in Akhbar in 2018, I described the financial engineering. I said it reminded me of Kama Sutra in the sense that every chapter was a new position, but the end result is the same. So financial engineering is a very fancy term. Lebanese people, culturally, they like engineers. When you are born, your parents tell you to either become an engineer or marry one. So when you hear financial engineering, you think, oh, this is a great thing. So when you narrow it down to the basics, all it is I'm paying you a very, very high interest in dollars, and then I'm printing lira in return. That's all it is. So when you analyze that, what was it used for? It was used for two purposes. One was a bailout of 2 or 3 banks, and the other reason was to try to attract or seduce dollars from the expats mainly. To carry on, to cover the balance of payment deficit, to carry on our addiction to dollars, to back the peg. And again, to bail out those banks. The mistake that was made, in my opinion, in 2016 wasn't necessarily financial engineering per se. It was the fact that no equity stakes were taken in the banks. So, for example, one bank received $856 million in revenue that year. Bonuses were paid based on that revenue to all the senior management who, bought chalets at Fara and Ferraris with that money. And it was all at the expense of the taxpayer. Okay, $856 million is more than this bank is worth today. So what should have been done instead is do the way the Brits did it with RBS, or the Americans did it in the US. They gave the bailout, the money, taxpayer money, but they took equity stakes in the name of the US taxpayer or the British taxpayer. What we should have done is taken stakes in the banks, fired management that got the bank where they were, replaced them with new management, and then stopped all bonuses, by the way, to all the senior management, fired the board even, replace the board, and then once every penny is paid back to the Lebanese taxpayer, then you get out of the bank, and then you let it go back to being a free market, free enterprise institution. That's what didn't happen. So the problem is when you gave this free money to these 2 or 3 banks, guess what all the other banks said? They said, what about me? I want some of that free cash. And then we got addicted to this, to this cocaine of easy money. By the way, that's another requirement by the IMF. That's a requirement by every diplomat I've spoken to from all the major Western countries. Have said the same thing. They've asked for this capital controls law. I don't know the answer to that. They've given a million excuses. I'm going to give you the macro answer and the micro answer. So I met with a senior guy in government, with this new government, in the first week on the job, and they said they're going to pass it in 2 weeks, and it hasn't been passed until now. There's a whole variety of reasons why it hasn't been passed. Number one, I think it's one of the levers of power. In the good old days, the levers of power were basically, a guy like you, I'm in government, I find you a job through Wasta. And so basically I gain your loyalty and your family's loyalty and their votes by giving you this, some stupid job in government, right? Or if you're a rich guy, I'll give you a kickback on a contract, and then I win you that way. Today, there's not enough money to do either of those 2 things. So what is the only lever of power left for the ruling elite today? It's the super wasta, allowing you to withdraw $100,000 in cash or to transfer overseas when the average Lebanese can't get out even $100 out of the bank. So that's a lever of power they'd like to hold on to, perhaps. That's one reason. Another reason is more technical. For example, I know that they were discussing this on Monday in the Majlis Nuwab, in the Chamber of Deputies. And one of the objections was they, as a prerequisite to the capital controls law, they have to lift bank secrecy. Because remember, if I allow you to say, withdraw $10,000 to help your kid who's studying in the US, what if you had 5 accounts? You can get 10 grand out of every account, right? So the secrecy law allows the government to look at all the accounts so that you don't cheat by taking out 10 grand from each account for that one son you have, Okay, so one of the suggestions I gave him is like, if you're so concerned about lifting secrecy on everything else because you don't want to do that, fine. Why don't you have the person that wants to transfer 10 grand sign a waiver that he or she gives up the bank secrecy rights in order to be allowed to withdraw. That said, I think bank secrecy laws in Lebanon are a bit outdated and should be removed. So that's the micro and macro reason for the whole thing.